Right, now that we have our ball showing on the screen, we now want to add animation to it, okay? And that is that we want it to start incrementing the ball movement every certain amount of times a second, okay? In order to that, we need to create what's called a dispatcher timer, okay? So normally a timer object is what we'd use to create time-based events. But because we're doing this in the front end, because we're doing this in what's called the thread, and that's basically the process of execution that controls the front end, that is known as the dispatcher, okay? And so we specifically need to use a dispatcher timer in order to do this. Okay, so I just want to make sure I get this right. So dispatcher.timer, no. I think it's just dispatcher timer and I need to add it in. Yeah, there we go, use system Windows threading. Okay, and that creates me a dispatcher timer object. Okay, and then, oh, I've put it in the wrong place again. Just go there. And then here, when I create that, I'm going to now create the timer object. So the timer equals new dispatcher timer. Now, if you look here, this gives you, actually no, I don't want to set anything on there. Just create it as normal. And now what I want to do is I want to, so the timer, I want to create a interval, okay, which sets the span between the when the timer is going to be started. New time span, and that's where, if I look in there, the different things I can put in tells me how long it's going to be. So you can set it in ticks, in hours, minutes, seconds, or in days, hours, minutes, seconds, or in days, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. And this is one that I want because I want it running roughly every 30 or so milliseconds, okay? And I'll show you how I work this out. I did say to you the other day that we're looking for something that's going to run 30 times a second, okay? So if I take 1,000 and divide that by 30, I get 33.3. Okay, so I'm going to say every 33 milliseconds. So 0 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and 33 milliseconds. And what that means now is that when I set this running, that is going to create a timer event every 33 milliseconds. Okay, and then the timer dot tick. Okay, so if you notice, this has got the lightning strike. Okay, and so this is the event that gets called. Now, this is like, for example, on the button, there's a click, and that all we do is we double click on the front end, and it generates our little our callback function. But when we looked at that behind the screens, we saw somewhere there was a button dot click plus equals, and then it set the name of the event that gets called. We've got to do this ourselves this time. So we're going to say plus equals, so it's going to add to whatever's there, okay, and then I've got to give the name of my function for which I want to call 33 times every 33 milliseconds. So I'm going to call it update balls. Okay. Now, that obviously doesn't exist. It's giving me an error, but if I click on that, it'll say generate that for me, and it generates it and it puts the correct parameters in. Okay, so every time you have what's called an event, a callback function, okay, it always follows this same pattern of the two things are passed in. One is the sender, so that's what's actually created the callback. So in this case, it's going to be our main window, and the next one is the event args, and that is anything specific to the event. And when we start looking at mouse events, you'll see that the event args can be quite specific. But for here, we've got to send them in, but we're actually not going to do anything with them. Okay, so when we get into this function, that means we have 33 milliseconds have passed, and at which point we now want to update our balls. So the world dot tick. You can see why I use the word tick. It's quite a common word for a something that's happening after a given amount of time. So the world tick. So that calls all the balls to update, and then I want to call my render. And that should now, every time it's called, just calls the balls to move just a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of this render, don't need that anymore. Okay, and then at the end I'm going to, the final thing I'm doing is I've got to stop the timer. The timer dot start. And that should start the timer running, and that means every 33 milliseconds this gets called, it ticks the balls and then renders them. So let's just give that a quick run, and now we should see that one ball that we created should start moving across the screen.